Hi. Harm experienced as a child may qualify as persecution for the purposes of asylum, even if the same harm would not equal persecution for an adult. This has always been clear in the asylum officer training manuals, but the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals today held for the first time in a decision that decision makers must take into account the child's age at the time the harm occurs. I'm Lindsay Wilkes, an immigration attorney with Alight Legal, immigration law firm. We're located in Washington, D.C. We serve clients all over the U.S. and all over the world. And we come weekly here on Facebook and also YouTube to bring updates and also just bring information and provide and share information about the immigration process. A lot of our discussions center on asylum. However, we also provide representation in family-based cases, VAWA, other humanitarian cases. So we do cover a lot of topics. Today, though, the Fourth Circuit issued a decision impacting asylum cases that deal with harm that occurred when the applicant was a child. So that's what we're going to discuss a little bit. I want to go over this just so that you can be thinking about it as it may apply to your case, as it may apply to friends' cases, family, and it's just helpful information to keep in mind as you go through the asylum process. So the case that came out today is Portillo Flores v. Garland, and the case is holding that age can be a critical factor in the adjudication of asylum claims and may bear heavily on the question of whether an asylum applicant was indeed persecuted or whether he holds a well-founded fear of future persecution. Now, not only does harm done directly to the child count and must be included in the analysis of whether someone was persecuted and whether they're eligible for asylum, but also harm and threats to their family members or community. That's important as well. And the court outlined this and discussed this a little bit in today's decision. So because the child is so dependent on the family and community, then harm to that child's family and community should be considered. There were some other important reminders in the decision about what is persecution, when does someone qualify for asylum, and it's important as it relates to child-based cases or harm done to someone as when they were a child, but it's also important in all cases. So a few things that were sort of not analyzed, but a few things that the court reiterated in its decision today is physical harm is not necessarily required. Just because you did not suffer very serious long-term injuries, just because you didn't have to get medical attention, or maybe there wasn't even like short-term very physical harm, that doesn't necessarily mean that what happened to you shouldn't qualify for asylum. Also, as the Fourth Circuit has reiterated over and over again, death threats can equal persecution. So if as a child you were threatened with death, if as an adult you were threatened with death, depending on who the actor was, what the reason was, then that may qualify for persecution for asylum purposes. Also, this case again reiterated that harm and threats on account of your family membership could be protected for asylum purposes. And, this was a part of the decisions that were vacated last week, where Caitlin talked last week about the fact that domestic violence cases are now again viable asylum cases, and also nationwide. Again, we have BIA case holding that persecution on account of your family membership is a recognizable class, a recognizable group, and therefore you may be eligible for asylum based on your membership in your family. So a few things just to sort of put this in context. For your asylum case, or when you're thinking, what are my options to stay in the US because I can't return to my home country, think about the things that happened in your childhood. Those are very important. And maybe it is something different than what you fear now or what happened most recently before you left. But those incidents as a child could still be very, very important to your case and could win your case. So, a couple of things to think about is, I have a lot of clients who experienced ethnic-based violence as a child. And not only was my client directly affected, but his immediate family members and their communities. This happens a lot when government regimes are changing hands and when certain ethnic groups are fighting other ethnic groups. And so this is really quite common in a lot of countries, that at some point in your life, you may have been subjected to pretty serious harm and threats, physical attacks, forced displacement, starvation. There's a lot of different things that may have happened to you when you were a child that you should talk about with your attorney, that we should consider whether this should be a part of your case and if this is helpful and it helps increase the chance of your case being approved. Also, of course, a lot of women are subjected to female genital mutilation when they're children. This is persecution, whether you're a child or an adult, but it's just something to consider in terms of the lasting impacts of the persecution. Serious child abuse is another common situation we see. Maybe there was some gender-based violence in your family. The father may have been very physically abusive against the wife and only the female children. But maybe he was very abusive to all of the children. And if that's the case, that's still worth discussing with your attorney to see if your situation may fit in to a class protected for asylum purposes. And if this case, looking at the child standard or a child-sensitive approach, would help in your case. A couple of other things to consider is, and where I see the harassment and harm that truly does rise to the level of persecution for my clients when they were kids, whereas maybe as adults it doesn't seem that serious, but as children what they had to go through definitely rose to the level of persecution. But a lot of people are harassed and beaten up and bullied because of their sexual orientation when they're kids, or because of their perceived sexual orientation. Maybe you don't identify as gay, but perhaps you were a little more feminine, and therefore your family or community members bullied you, harassed you, did really mean things to you. That would be another common area where this child-sensitive approach would be very important to consider, and important to present facts to the decision maker and the case law to the decision maker to show them how they can get to yes, how they can approve this asylum case. So, of course, it's important to understand that it's not just the fact that you were harmed and that physical harm or psychological harm or the death threats rose to the level of persecution, but there's several separate analyses too that have to take place. So we have to consider who caused the harm, for what reason was the harm caused, did you have protection from the state or your country or government? These are all things that also have to be considered. So it's important to think about the entire situation before you just file for asylum or before you just add these things to your case. But it's worth the conversation. It's very much worth the conversation with your attorney. Even if the event happened a very long time ago, still share these memories with your attorney, because it truly could be very helpful for your asylum case. Even if it's completely unrelated to your most recent harm or completely unrelated to the harm you fear in the future, If that harm you suffered in the past rises to the level of persecution, and if we can meet these other parts to the analysis, then it's going to make your asylum case a lot easier. Also, perhaps the harm was so severe when you were a child that that's enough to find that you're eligible for asylum. Asylum can be granted in certain situations when the severity of the past harm was so extreme that you shouldn't have to go back to your home country. And whether or not you have been harmed again since you were a child, or even if you do not actually fear that physical harm if you go back, there may be still a way to have your case granted if the past harm you were subjected to as a child or an adult, but we're talking about the child standard tonight, if that harm you suffered as a child was so severe, you may actually be able to get humanitarian asylum. So asylum law is complicated. Have a consultation. Get an attorney who cares about you. Get an attorney who's going to keep up with the changes and there's going to be interested in your case to try to figure these things out and figure out how to best present your case and make sure that all the elements are covered. Remember that this is just a very general overview. This is just bringing you information based on this case that came out today. And this is an individualized advice. It is important to have individualized advice about your own case, about your own situation from an experienced attorney. And so today we're very happy about this case that makes it very clear that a decision maker must utilize a child-sensitive approach or a child standard when reviewing asylum cases. Again, even if you're an adult now, the important analysis is when it happened to you. And if you were at a tender age when certain types of harm happened, and then it was probably a lot more impactful and damaging, and that's important for us to consider in your asylum case. I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to check to see if there are any questions. Please feel free to ask questions. You can put questions in the chat box. You can also send us private message through Facebook. Remember, the chat box is public, so if you post something, make sure that you're okay with others seeing it. Otherwise, you can send us a private message. You can email our firm. I have the email address here on the screen, info@alightlegal.com. We would be happy to schedule a consultation with you, happy to discuss your case, even if it's already pending and this makes you remember something that was really quite important and that maybe it should be something added to your case. We can discuss that as well. So thank you for joining. I hope this is helpful, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Bye.